Thank you all for joining us. I'm Patrick Comins. I'm the Executive Director for the Connecticut Audubon Society. We are a statewide independent conservation organization that's been around since 1898. We work in conservation in 4 ways. We manage more than 3,000 acres of property in the state, and we try to make that as wildlife friendly, bird and other wildlife friendly as possible. We also like to engage people in meaningful conservation action, things like our Audubon Alliance for Coastal Waterbirds and our Osprey Nation, give opportunities for people to make a difference. Someone once said that the job of Connecticut Audubon Society isn't to conserve nature, it's to empower people to conserve nature. We also are active in advocacy for making sure that good policy gets passed and bad policy doesn't. And we are only as strong as our grassroots there. So we like to engage people in opportunities to contact their elected officials at various levels on important issues. You can find out more about that at our website, ctaudubon.org. And then finally, we also have nature education sites around the state. We have one in Pomfret, Glastonbury, Milford, Old Lyme, 2 in Fairfield, Milford, and Sherman. Hopefully I'm not forgetting anybody. But we have all sorts of activities from preschool all the way up to adult. And with that, I'll get started. I'm going to talk about making your yard more friendly for birds and other wildlife. Hold on, my slides aren't advancing for some reason. All right, great. Making the most of your landscape. And I have to thank one of our board members, Patrick Lynch, for helping me with some of the graphics on this presentation. If you don't have his book, Field Guide to Long Island Sound, I highly recommend it. He also has one for Cape Cod. But the one for Long Island Sound, if you spend any time on Long Island Sound, is really a must-have. You may have seen in the news in recent months about the decline of songbirds across the nation. Cornell did a study from a bunch of different sources, from the Breeding Bird Survey, from radar studies, and Christmas bird counts, and has shown that our birds have disappeared over the last 50 or so years. In fact, nearly 3 billion birds have gone since 1970. Kind of mind-blowing that 1970 is 50 years ago, but that's another story. Nearly 3 billion birds fewer in North America than there were in 1970. And really the key factor that's driving that is habitat destruction and degradation. There are some other factors at play, pollution, disease, overharvesting, exotic species, but in 88% of imperiled species in one study, the leading cause of imperilment was habitat destruction and degradation. How does that play out in a species like wood thrush? Wood thrush are fairly common throughout Connecticut. They nest in deciduous woodlands throughout the state, but they're actually of global conservation concern. They're considered near threatened on the IUCN red list of global species of conservation concern. They nest throughout the eastern part of North America. And when you think about it, this biome, the eastern deciduous forest, has been more impacted than almost any biome on Earth, except maybe some of the European biomes where they've been doing it for thousands of years. But we've really been impacting the eastern forest for 400 years. And a lot of people think of conservation issues as things that are happening in the tropics, be it the Amazon rainforest or the Great Barrier Reef of Australia. But right in our backyard, we have conservation issues that are very important and things that we can make a difference in. Wood thrush need 3 things for healthy populations. They need deciduous woodlands. They also need montane rainforests in Central America. They're a migratory species. They spend their winters from Mexico down to Panama, and they move back and forth between North America and Central America, and they're actually on the move at this time of year. So they also need a third leg of their tripod of healthy populations, and that is migratory stopover habitat. This is downtown Fairfield, and if you're a wood thrush, they actually fly at night, and as first light approaches, they tend to be approaching the coastline. I don't know if that's just circumstance or they time it that way, but important stopover sites along the coastline are especially important for them. So if you're a wood thrush and happen to find yourself over downtown Fairfield, there isn't a lot of habitat. There's a little patch over here. There's lawn here, which isn't particularly good habitat for wood thrush. There's a lot of development over here with probably invasive species and cats and not particularly good understory for foraging. But right over here, we have our 6-acre birdcraft sanctuary, which gets loaded with birds of all kinds in migration. And it shows how important even a small space can be for migratory stopover of land birds. So even if you don't have a lot of neotropical migrant land birds nesting in your yard, you can make a difference for migrating land birds. And it's in inland Connecticut as well, but it's especially important along the coast. Now, this is from a study that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did on migration using radar signals. And if you look at unfiltered weather radar on a night when it isn't raining, you can actually see these blobs that emerge just after dark and then contract just before dawn. And meteorologists call that ground clutter, and ornithologists call them birds. And there's millions of birds that pass over particularly coastal Connecticut in spring and fall migration. The areas where there's red are where higher numbers of birds are detected. You can see there's an important area over eastern Connecticut, but also lower Fairfield County has a lot of red and orange. And even if you're inland, there are still migratory birds passing over. These numbers are pretty, this area gets so many birds. Cape May, you hear a lot about Cape May migration, but actually more birds are recorded on radar in our area than there are in Cape May. Another thing to consider is that Connecticut actually has the highest percentage of what is known as the urban wildlife interface. You have, on this map shows this, it has the highest percentage of any state in the union. There are wilderness areas in New England. There's the Green Mountains, the White Mountains. There's the Green Mountains. There's the Adirondacks. There are highly developed areas in the Northeast, the New York metropolitan area, the Central Connecticut Valley, much of Fairfield County. But this orange color is showing where there's a confluence or a juxtaposition of humans and wildlife habitat. And very few places on Earth have so many people living in such high quality wildlife habitat as Connecticut. So that means that what we do in our yards and our urban suburban parks has an influence on important wildlife habitat, pretty much no matter where you are in Connecticut. So by improving habitat in your yard, you can make a difference beyond your yard. So if you want to improve your yard or other space for birds and other wildlife, what are some of the things you want to take into account? Well, you want to know what watershed it's a part of, which way the water drains off of your property. You can do things to infiltrate that water and treat so that it goes into the ground rather than into impervious surfaces by putting rain gardens, et cetera, in. You want to know what sort of wildlife is in your area. If you want to improve habitat for migrating wood thrush, you're in luck. But if you want to improve habitat in this area for, say, greater roadrunners, you're not going to have much luck. It also is helpful to know what the history of your yard and area has been. Was it formerly agricultural land, as much of this area was? My old house in Meriden turned out to be, it was a meadow, but in the neighborhood there was some properties that used to be a giant silverware factory, and then that was knocked down and turned into suburban lots. What ecosystems is it a part of or near? Is it near some important bird areas? Is it near some significant wetlands or other key habitat? Is it near a large forest block or an area that might be important for shrubland birds? The geography and geology are important. Which way is the aspect of your yard? That amounts how much light you're going to get. The soils in your yard are going to determine what sort of plants you can plant successfully. And of course, what is the weather? You want to choose plants that are going to be, that are going to be drought tolerant. We tend to have droughty summers, but can also handle heavy rains. And you also want to make sure that their hardiness, the hardiness zone is appropriate for Connecticut. So knowing your landscape context is very important. If you live in the middle of woods, there are things you can do to make sure that your yard has less of an impact on the surrounding landscape. You might want to stop feeding grains in your feeder if you're in the middle of the woodlands in the nesting season, because then that might attract brown-headed cowbirds that will go lay their eggs in the nests of other birds throughout the landscape. You may want to create soft edges so that you don't have a lawn going right up to the edge of the forest, that it may be a tapered edge to the forest, that you may have shrub islands that can be connective habitat throughout the woodland. So therefore, your fragmentation in the forest is creating less of a negative impact. If you live in an area that's primarily open, we always talk about planting trees as something that is valuable to do, and it can be good from a carbon sequestration potential. The more trees you plant, the more carbon you can sequester. But not all areas are appropriate for planting trees. If you have a big grassland area, it could be detrimental to the wildlife if you were to plant trees there. This is an area in Stonington, Connecticut, where bobolinks nest. And if you were to plant trees there, the bobolinks would abandon this nesting area. They like to have an open aspect and a minimum size for nesting. This is actually about a 15-acre field, which is really at the minimum size. But if you live in suburbia, pretty much almost anything you do is going to be better than the ecological desert of lawns and invasive species that most suburban habitats represent. If this is your yard here and you plant that for, if you landscape it for wildlife, you're giving them sort of a stepping stone or a fire escape as they find themselves over this neighborhood in migration. They will be able to find their way there. And it's not just birds. You can attract butterflies and other pollinators with a fairly small investment in space, creating a small pollinator garden and planting some host plants. And of course, if you live in urban areas, what you do in whatever space you have can be vitally important, because birds do find their way to urban areas. They find themselves over urban areas in the morning and need to find places of shelter and rest. Plus, there's a lot you can do for pollinators in urban settings, even on a balcony. So what are some of the things that you can do in your property to figure out how your home fits in to wildlife habitat? Of course, you can put up feeders. I could give a whole talk on feeders. It's a complicated topic. Like I said, if you're in a forest, you want to stop feeding grains in the nesting season. You can feed millet in the wintertime for the migrating and wintering sparrows. Sunflower seeds are really attractive. It's a complicated issue, and I have some resources at the end that can talk a bit about feeders. You can have plants that are beneficial to butterflies and bees, and we'll talk a bit about that as the presentation goes on. Another thing is you want to do things in your yard that makes it more attractive to wildlife in all seasons. So you want to plant things that are going to be beneficial in the summertime, things that are going to provide food and cover in the wintertime, and things that are going to provide early nectar for the queen bumblebees in the spring, and late nectar for the migrating monarchs in the late fall up to the first frost and beyond. There are trees that have mast that create, that have seeds that birds like, or fruits. We'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of that coming up. You can do nesting boxes. One thing I'm going to say about nesting boxes is it's not something you can just put up and forget. You have to monitor and maintain your nesting boxes. One thing, you don't want house sparrows to be nesting there because they're an invasive species that are detrimental to nesting tree swallows and bluebirds and purple martins. You know, snags and cliffs and caves can be important habitat. And of course, you either have a cave or a cliff on your property or you don't. But one thing that you can do is leave some standing dead trees if you have them on your property. If you want to get rid of an invasive Norway maple and it's far away from an area where you're going to be congregating on your property, you might want to try girdling it rather than cutting it down. Or if you have a tree that's died and it's away in a safe area, you might want to leave it up for the woodpeckers and other cavity nesting birds. Brush and rock piles. You hear a lot about brush piles, but you don't hear as much about rock piles. But rock piles can be important because they're thermally insulating. In the summertime, they're cooler and damper, and in the wintertime, they're warmer. So they're a magnet for many species of invertebrates, plus things like snakes and amphibians. And some birds will actually go right to rock piles to feed on the insects that collect there. Some birds like to have dust and grit baths, or they actually will eat some of the grit to help with their digestion. And some birds need an extra source of calcium. So some birds are attracted to salt and ground up oyster shells. Water source is very important, and we're going to talk a bit more about that in general later coming up. One thing in general, you want to take into account all 4 seasons. There are things you can do in all 4 seasons to benefit wildlife, and you know, don't just think about the nesting season. Water is one of the most important things you can do to attract wildlife to your property, and you'll attract a variety of wildlife that wouldn't be attracted by feeders. Cedar waxwings, you can plant things to attract cedar waxwings, but you can also attract them by having a bird bath or a water feature in your yard. If you have the means to put in and the space to put in an actual water feature, this is from my old office in Stratford, and we had a donor that wanted to see some fresh water on the property. The site was surrounded by salt water, but there was very little fresh water on the property. And we've actually followed up and done this at Milford Point recently as well. And we planted a garden of native plants around it. And this really, it changed the whole site. The many more species were wintering over. We had new species nesting on the property. We actually got purple martins using the property now after we put in the water feature, because dragonflies were laying their eggs in it and emerging from the water. They were attracted to it, and purple martins like to feed on dragonflies. It's just another view of the water feature. There was a pump, and you can see the falling water here. You can see some of the native plants like little blue stem that were planted. This is some goldenrods here. There's some butterfly weed. This is Joe Pye weed. This is a high bush blueberry. These are paper birches here. This is a black cherry tree that was incorporated into the landscape design. So we chose a variety of native plants to plant in this garden, and we're hoping to do that over in Milford. We have some pending grants that will enhance our water feature there with native plantings around that. We're actually hoping to do a sort of a massive invasive removal and habitat restoration project on the upland parts of Milford, if we can get the grant funding for that. Milford Point, that is. And you can attract birds that would normally not come to your feeders, although this bird will come if you put orange halves out in the warmer months. But this is a orchard oriole, and outside my office window, this male orchard oriole would come every day to bathe in the afternoon, and his family would come at various parts of the day. The female and the young birds would come, but you know, they're generally not going to come to a feeder, but they will come to a water feature. And just some tips and tricks. You know, you don't need to install anything fancy. Just a small hole in the ground that's lined will work. The running water is a help. You can also just do a trickle from your hose to accomplish that. If you can put a heater in it, that's all the better to keep it open in the wintertime. But you want to make sure that there's some shallow areas for the birds to bathe in, and also maybe put some rocks in there that will offer perches for the birds to get a drink. The deep water is not going to do many birds much good. Some other tricks, if you're going to have a bird bath, which is also beneficial, a dripping hose can be helpful. Just that dripping sound of water can attract birds, especially in the droughty months of summer. Or you can just hang a bucket with a hole in it over the bird bath, and just that sound will attract birds. And then they make little pumps and recirculating and agitators that you can put in the bird bath, some of which are even solar powered. And if you can get a bird bath that's heated, that's all the better, because the other time of year when water is scarce is in the wintertime. The advantage of having a hose dripping into it is it actually keeps the water clean and full. Now, another thing you want to take into account is your vertical structure. You want to provide vertical structural diversity within your yard, because different species of wildlife like to forage at different heights in the strata. Now, this is actually showing succession. And if you were to cut down a forest and plow up the field, you'll end up with bare soil for a while. Eventually, lichens and moss would start coming in, and then some annual herbs and perennial herbs. You'd start getting some shrubs growing in, and small trees, and larger trees as it goes on. But this also illustrates something that you want to provide, ideally in your yard. If you can create what I like to call the stadium effect, then you'll be attracting a greater variety of birds in migration, and butterflies as well. And the stadium effect is sort of making it look like a stadium, having lower habitats, managed succession, if you will, up to your perennial herbs and small bushes and smaller trees, and up into your existing larger trees. This is an example of what it looks like in practice. This is from another former office of mine, the Bent of the River in Southbury. And you can see there's an organic lawn here. There are actually some birds that will forage on lawns. Then there's some knee-high forbs here, for pollinators. There's black-eyed Susans. There's some cardinal lobelia. This is some jewelweed. These are goldenrods. These are some Joe Pye weed. This is tall ironweed, which gets to be about 8 feet tall. And then back over here, there's some native shrubs that were planted: red osier dogwood, cranberry bush viburnum, winterberry. And then this is a small tree. It happens to be a non-native one, but one that birds really like, and that is the star magnolia. And that's been in cultivation for hundreds of years and has not escaped cultivation. And actually the birds, the thrushes and the vireos really like the berries it produces. I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. Medium-sized trees like this red cedar, and then going up into your canopy here, this is a magnificent red oak. Of course, you either have the mature oaks or you don't, but sometimes patience is required, and if you can plant some oaks, planting for the next generation is good. It doesn't have to be a classic stadium effect, but as long as you're providing all of those various habitat types, the organic lawn, which you want to try to minimize as much as possible, but we recognize that you have some areas that you may want to congregate, or your children or grandchildren may want to congregate on. There's a wildflower meadow here. There's some smaller trees and some shrubs, and then there's some taller trees going up into mature sugar maple here. This is, I think, a flowering dogwood, some tall white pines over here. No matter what height a bird likes to forage at, it's going to find habitat in a situation like this. Of course, this is a good time to talk about pesticides. You really want to minimize your use of pesticides. For one thing, your lawn gets addicted to them. It kills the beneficial creatures in your lawn as well as the detrimental ones. So you need to, once you start using pesticides, your lawn gets addicted to them. And you're also killing, the butterflies you may and bees that you may be trying to attract to your yard. And these pesticides are not the greatest things for birds as well, and potentially, you know, for your pets and even your family. Even organic pesticides tend to be non-specific. So you know, permethrin, it's, although it's not, it's less toxic to humans and birds presumably. You're killing off the bird food um, by killing off all the insects rather than you know, doing an organic approach like beneficial nematodes or milky spore in your lawn. So natives, I'm not a strict nativist, but I do like to encourage that you include some native plants in your landscaping. And why is that the case? It's because our insects and our birds have co-adapted with our native plants over thousands of years, at least since the last ice age. They time their migration to show up when certain plants are in bloom. The butterflies show up to lay their eggs when a plant is you know, in perfect state of tenderness for their caterpillars, or sometimes they winter over as eggs. Um, uh, and caterpillars are very important to all of our songbirds, even some of our inveterate seed eaters like cardinals and chickadees and titmice switch over to caterpillars in the nesting season. And the reason is there's a lot of protein and energy in the caterpillars. And when you think about it, a bird does all of its growing in the first 4 weeks of its life. Once it leaves the nest, it's the largest size it's ever going to be in its life. It stops growing. And another thing about the caterpillars is they're highly nutritious. They have a lot of vitamins, particularly the carotenoids in them. So when you talk to any researcher who's studied nesting birds and bird nests, and you ask what baby birds eat, they'll say little green caterpillars. This is a wood thrush that was gathering green caterpillars underneath a canopy of chestnut oaks in Lyme, Connecticut. And not, you know, not all native plants are boring. You can do a native plant garden that's absolutely beautiful. There's some azaleas in here. This is a photo by Doug Tallamy. Some native rhododendrons. This is a beautiful native shade garden. Or if you have a little bit of sunlight to work with, you can do a sort of an enhanced meadow. It's rare to find a meadow like this in nature, but sometimes I like to say what you're trying to create in your yard is supernatural habitat, where it's almost better than natural habitat because you're concentrating a lot of beneficial things in a small area. And that can be really beneficial to your pollinators in particular. But notice structurally, this is not like your formal garden. There's not mulch in between the plants. You let the volunteers come up. This tight packedness is important. There's the varying structural levels of diversity here. And it's an absolutely beautiful scene with some swamp milkweed, with some cardinal lobelia, with some 2 different varieties of Joe Pye weed. This is some ironweed here. And this is, that's goldenrods. So what are some of the things that you can do in your yard in the various strata levels to make habitat better for wildlife? We can start in your lawn. Aside from trying to go organic with your lawn, you can also let some violets creep in there, or maybe encourage violets to come in by throwing some seeds around or moving some of their tubers. The violets bloom a little bit later than this time of year, and your yard is beautiful while they're in bloom, especially if you can get some of the white ones and purple ones. And then they die back, and you can mow them down. And once they die back, they start attracting this critter, or this whole family of butterflies, the fritillaries. They actually sniff out the tubers of the dormant violets and lay their eggs on those tubers, and then the eggs overwinter. And then as the vegetation starts to grow in the spring, the caterpillars emerge, and then they eat the violet leaves until they pupate and become adult adult butterflies. And I guess butterflies are adult caterpillars. So if you want to attract more fritillaries to your pollinator garden, plant some violets in your yard, and then they can sniff out those violets from miles around. Likewise, if you plant things in the carrot family, like carrots or parsley or dill, you'll attract this little curious creature, which is black and green and yellow and a little bit of white on it. This is a black swallowtail caterpillar. So by including those host plants in your garden, you're going to attract more of the adults coming to your butterfly bush. But you know, your butterfly garden shouldn't just be butterfly bushes, but I actually like butterfly bush in this area. It's not invasive, especially if you deadhead it. You know, cut off the flowers before they go to seed. That'll also encourage it to bloom right up to the late frost. Yes, there are a lot of great natives that you should include in your butterfly garden, including the host plants. And the only thing that this provides is nectar. But there are very few things that bloom right from, say, July all the way up to and beyond the first frost, and that and butterfly bush is one of them. Another thing you could do in your lawns is encourage clovers, or don't discourage clovers. You can actually buy seed online or at your favorite nature set, nursery store. White clover is native, and it's an important nectar plant for many species of bumblebees and bees, native bees, and particularly our small skipper butterflies. Another one that is not native but is naturalized is the red clover, and some of the skippers really like the red clover. And this is a third species of clover down here that you probably can't find commercially, and that's birdfoot trefoil. Now, this is obviously not a lawn, but you can let let the clovers grow in your lawn, and they fix nitrogen right out of the atmosphere. And so it means every time you're mowing your lawn when there's clovers, you're fertilizing the soil. Another thing is that you're creating more diversity in your lawn. So therefore, if a pest gets into your lawn, it's not going to be as detrimental because it'll still be green with your clovers that are there. Milkweeds are very important, and we all you know, hear about them as a host plant, but they're also very important as a nectar source. And in fact, most of the butterfly counts are done right around the 1st to 4th of July area, and the reason for that is because that's when common milkweed is in bloom. Now, this is a hair streak, an Acadian hair streak, which is a kind of a rare butterfly. But if you can attract some of these rare hair streaks to your garden just by having a small stand of common milkweed there. Now, it likes sun, so you need a sunny area, but it's not something you want to have in your formal garden because it tends to spread by tuber, by runners, and by seed, and it gets a little leggy. So if you have a nice quiet corner of your yard, then you can plant the common milkweed. But I wouldn't put it in you know, in your front yard or an area where you want it to be aesthetically pleasing. Now, the extra benefit of milkweeds are that you are also helping out monarch butterflies, and they lay their eggs on several species of milkweeds exclusively, and that makes their caterpillars taste horrible, and it makes the adults taste horrible, and gives them some measure of protection as they're migrating south. Now, another thing that is perhaps even more important in in this area, if you want to help butterflies, is making sure that you have late nectar sources that are, you know, some things in bloom, because monarchs are actually migrating through all the way up to Thanksgiving or so. So if you can get things that are frost hardy, you'll be benefiting monarchs that are migrating down to Mexico. But there are other species of milkweed that are beneficial to both as a nectar source and as a host plant for monarchs, and are a little bit better behaved in a more formal garden situation. This is swamp milkweed, and despite its name, it is actually fairly drought hardy once it's established. What it is it's what is known as a facultative wetland plant. It will tolerate being wet almost all the time, but it also will tolerate droughts. And the added advantage to having multiple species of milkweed in your yard is that they bloom at different times a year. So first, your purple milkweed blooms. then your common milkweed, then your swamp milkweed, and then finally your butterfly weed blooms. And that will grow, that has the advantage of being incredibly drought tolerant. So if you have really sandy, droughty soils, once you establish this plant, you'll never need to water it. And it is a host plant for monarchs, and it is also an important nectar source. This happens to be a very rare and endangered butterfly called the northern meadowlark. I just have this in there to show that a great variety of butterflies will use butterfly weed as a source of nectar. Also, wasps will use it, and you know, you may be afraid of wasps, but they tend to be very docile when they're feeding. Wasps tend to only be aggressive when they're around their nests, and the most aggressive one is the yellow jacket, which is not even a native and doesn't tend to get attracted to your pollinator garden. You know, in my butterfly garden, I was constantly in there taking macro pictures of wasps and trimming things, and I never got stung by any of the pollinators that visited the garden. The other thing about milkweeds is you can deadhead them after they go to bloom, and sometimes they'll go into a second bloom. And sometimes, you know, if you're careful that there are no caterpillars on it to begin with, you can actually cut down your common milkweed. And the monarchs actually, they tend to be a little bit later migrants in our area, and they like fresh shoots of milkweed. So cutting them down to the ground and allows them to grow up more, and actually will be more attractive to monarchs. I find swamp milkweed and butterfly weed a little bit more attractive to monarchs than the common milkweed, unless you do that. So there are a great variety of beautiful butterflies that you can attract to your yard, and they all have various host plants. This is an admiral, or this is a lady butterfly, a painted lady. This is a tiger swallowtail, which has a wide variety of host plants, including apples and cherries. This is a red admiral, which actually likes to lay its eggs on stinging nettles, and I believe hops as well. This is a common buckeye butterfly. This is the black swallowtail. We talked to lays its eggs on members of the carrot family, and a monarch, of course, with milkweeds. This is a red spotted purple, and red spotted purples actually won't come into your nectar garden, but sometimes they'll if you have some manure, they'll come in and feed on that, a little area of manure that you keep moist. And also if you have sand that has high mineral content, particularly if you have a little bit of crushed marble in it, that will attract them. And then also rotting fruit will attract them. And by having a nectar garden, you're going to benefit more than just the bees and the butterflies, because many of our birds are insectivores, and particularly in fall migration, they are attracted to your pollinator gardens. So even a small area of pollinator gardens will attract warblers like this prairie warbler that came in and was feeding on the ironweed in my small, 5-foot by 20-foot butterfly garden. Some plants benefit both birds and insects directly. This is purple coneflower, or echinacea, which is actually not native right to our area. The one that's native to our area is called pale purple coneflower, but they're native as close as New York State. You can see that each of these are actually each a flower. It's a composite. And they have they're so rich in nectar that they have drops of dew on the end of them, and they're attractive to many species of pollinators, including sweat bees. But each of these becomes a seed, and as soon as the petals start to fall off, you get goldfinches come in and start pulling the petals off, so the seeds ripen faster. So if you have a stand of the purple coneflower, you'll be attracting goldfinches to it in the late summer. And if you leave it standing, you can attract things like the pine siskin, and goldfinches still will come in the wintertime. Goldenrods are very important late sets, the source of nectar. This happens to be a red-banded hair streak, and you're not allergic to goldenrods. You're allergic to things that are wind pollinated, that are blooming at the same time as the goldenrod. Things like ragweed. This is an insect pollinated flower, and the pollen does not float around in the air. Also, asters are very important. I like to think of a pollinator garden as a slow motion fireworks show. You want to start out with the early blooms like the violets and the clovers and some of our native shrubs and trees. Moving in, you want to make sure that there's pollen available from that early springtime for the queens, all the way up to and beyond the last frost. And our native asters are a great way to do that. And this happens to be New England aster, which comes in multiple different colors. You can cut it down right up to about the 1st of July, and it will grow. It will grow back and still bloom. Anise hyssop is another great one for bumblebees in particular. There are some specialized nectar feeders, including hummingbirds. And hummingbirds, the main thing is that they're attracted to red, and they're attracted to tube-shaped flowers. So trumpet honeysuckle is a great native vine to plant. Also cardinal lobelia, columbine, and pineapple sage. Pineapple sage is not native, but it is an effective. It's a great late bloomer for hummingbirds. Of course, you can put up feeders for hummingbirds, but they're going to be more effective if you have the proper plants around. You're going to attract more hummingbirds if you have the red flowers. And also, if you put up the hummingbird feeders, you're going to attract yellow jackets, and you need to make sure that the nectar stays clean. Another great plant is red bee balm. Cardinal lobelia will also attract other things beyond beyond the hummingbirds, including this is a cloudless sulfur. Sorry, I'm going a little longer than I had hoped. I'm expanding a little bit on some of the things early in the show. But having a healthy garden is, you just never know what you're going to find in a garden. You just need to look close, and you just never know. You might be surprised. You could have your pollinator garden for years and see something new. This actually is a native, really big scarab beetle that I discovered in the yard one day. So if you have a healthy pesticide-free yard, you just never know what you're going to find there. So what are some of the taller plants that you can provide to attract birds? This is one you're not going to buy, but if you just let it grow up, it's called pokeweed. It is in the deadly nightshade family, but you don't leave it probably near the kids' play area. But if you have a quiet corner of your yard, let some of this grow up. The birds will actually bring it in, and the birds love the berries. Some species of rose are invasive. Our multiflora rose is invasive, but we have 3 species of native rose that provide some of the similar structure to the multiflora rose. There's the Virginia rose, Carolina rose, and swamp rose, and they smell wonderful when they're in bloom. And their hips are the size that are beneficial to our native birds, unlike our ornamental roses, which have very big hips. Another thing you can do to plant to benefit cedar waxwings are serviceberries. Shadblow, Allegheny serviceberry, downy serviceberry, they love the berries. Now this may look like bird poop, but it's actually a caterpillar. And I planted a northern prickly ash in my yard, and it grows in the shade. It's hard to find commercially, but hopefully it will become with more native gardening becoming more popular. Hopefully we'll be able to find it more and more. And this is actually the caterpillar for giant swallowtail, and the host plant for that is northern prickly ash in our area. So if you have some of that growing in your yard, you're going to get more of these giant swallowtails visiting your pollen garden. Likewise, if you plant spicebush in a shady corner of your yard, not only do the birds like the berries, you're going to get more spice bush swallowtails visiting your butterfly garden. Native dogwoods are really helpful. One of my favorites is red osier dogwood. And the reason I think it has red stems is it's actually trying to attract birds to come in and eat the pest insects off of it. This is a Tennessee warbler, but a wide variety of warblers will congregate on red osier dogwood. This is a Blackburnian warbler, which is normally found really high up in the treetops. Also, flowering dogwood, although this is an oak I'm showing here, there is a nearby flowering dogwood. But this is a berry of a flowering dogwood, Cornus florida, and it is a favorite of this bird and as well as native thrushes. And it may not look like much in the fall, but they're absolutely beautiful in the spring. The males are. This is a scarlet tanager. Now, this is a popular fruit or an important fruit, not because it's popular, but because the birds don't like it, and they leave it up unless absolutely necessary. And it can be important in spring migration when early migrants like cedar waxwings or robins return, and then there's a snowstorm, and then they'll just flock to the winterberry as a survival mechanism. Another fruit that will persist in the winter, into the winter, is bayberry, and it's not particularly popular, but it is a fruit of last resort. It's not popular though unless you're a yellow-rumped warbler, and it's actually so popular with them that they're called myrtle warblers, and myrtle is another name for bayberry. Poison ivy you're not going to plant or buy, but if you have a large enough yard and have an area that you can let it grow up, it is one of the best things for birds. And you can see this red foliage is actually it's what is known as a fruit flag, and it's trying to attract the birds in to eat the berries. Another vine that can be beneficial and won't harm your trees is Virginia creeper. And again, this fruit flag of red foliage telling the birds it has nutritious fruit and delicious fruit that wants to spread the seeds of. Eastern red cedar is another great one. That these are very popular waxy berries, and they can persist into the autumn migration. It's also a host plant for many species of butterflies and moths, including this is a juniper hairstreak. Black chokecherry is a small tree that can grow in the shade, and is a very it actually has fruits in the summertime, so it's a great way to benefit your nesting catbirds. Black cherry is a large tree, and it's a host plant for nearly 500 different species of butterflies and moths, and also has these seeds that will attract these fruit that will attract birds in the fall, including indigo buntings and Baltimore orioles. And of course, oaks. They're one of the most important trees in the landscape. And these are the flowers of oaks. And the warblers actually time their migration to show up when the oaks are in flower. And that's because the moths have laid their eggs in these, the moths and butterflies in these flowers, so that hoping to be there when the acorns start to grow. And any birder who's been at it a while will tell you that to find an oak that's in bloom is where you're going to find species of warbler. And if you find a good stand of oaks, you can find more than 20 species of warblers on a good day. This happens to be a Blackburnian warbler. And the reason is oaks are one of the most attractive species to our lepidopterans. More than 500 different species of caterpillars can be found on oaks, whereas a non-native tree like ginkgo biloba only attracts 4 species of caterpillars. Another one of my favorite trees is Nyssa sylvatica, black gum. And again, the fruit flag red foliage tells birds that there's these delicious fruits. And they're a favorite of woodpeckers and thrushes. Birches are important because they produce thousands, if not millions, of seeds in these structures known as catkins, which are sort of like a cone. And in the wintertime, they attract finches, including redpolls when they're around, siskins, and goldfinches. And evergreens are also important. almost all of our native evergreens and even some of our non-native evergreens are attractive to things like nuthatches and chickadees, but also sometimes to these eruptive migrants. This is a white-winged crossbill. And there's some other evergreens that are important, including the American holly. And another reason that evergreens are important is that they offer shelter in the wintertime. This happens to be a long-eared owl in American holly. Brush piles are important. They create some shelter for sparrows. You can actually throw white millet underneath your loosely packed. This is kind of, you want to have it so the birds can get in it, brush piles. Also, annuals are important for seed eaters. If you just till up an area of your yard, you're likely to get foxtail millets growing, but you can actually buy some seeds. German foxtail millet is one of the best. You can buy it on the web. And this is what good sparrow habitat looks like. It's early successional habitat. This is in the fall, and the giant foxtails are one of the favorite foods of migrating sparrows. So as I said, I'm not a strict nativist. I encourage people to plant natives, but I also, think that as long as it's not an invasive, if you want your pink dogwood, pink magnolia, it's beautiful this time of year. That's not particularly valuable to birds, but this one is. This is a star magnolia, and it gets these nutritious fruits that the birds eat in fall migration. And there is a native alternative called swamp magnolia or Magnolia virginiana or sweet bay magnolia, which also gets these fruits in the fall. Crab apples are a little bit controversial because they can tend to be a little bit invasive, but they have an added advantage of not only fruit that the birds like, but being in bloom when the warblers are in migration. So some of the warblers like to forage in the flowers of various apple trees and orchard trees. And if you have one that the fruit persists into the wintertime, you can attract waxwings, and if you're lucky, Bohemian waxwings. Butterfly bushes I talked a little bit about earlier, so I'm not going to go into that. There are a few annuals that you can plant that are beneficial, like a patch of sunflowers in your yard is one of the best ways to attract goldfinches to your yard. Also, cosmos. One of these days, I'm going to plant a giant field of cosmos like this. They're great for pollinators, and also the birds like the seeds. And this is an actual feeder plot that we planted at our Smith-Richardson Sanctuary. We tilled up the area and planted things like millet and sorghum and some wildflower and some zinnias and sunflowers and the German foxtail millets. And it's become a real paradise, attracting a wide variety and huge numbers of migrating sparrows in the fall. The idea is really that you want to create balanced communities, a variety of times of year, a variety of vertical structural diversity, and a variety of native plants. I'm not going to talk much about the pollinator pathways, but you can Google pollinator pathways, and that's basically the idea is to make your yards part of the landscape, thus benefiting the whole landscape. Some resources. This is a great book by Douglas Tallamy, Bringing Nature Home, How to Sustain Wildlife with Native Plants. And a couple other resources. This is, you can take a picture of this with your cell phone to get these names. Landscaping for Wildlife from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. It's really a great book. This is the Audubon Society to Attracting Birds, which is by Steve Kress, which goes into native plantings. It goes into water, and it goes into feeders and bird boxes as well. And again, Bringing Nature Home. Then this is a book specific to Connecticut, and it has the advantage of being free. It's enhancing your wildlife backyard habitat for wildlife. It's by Peter Picone from the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. This QR code will get you there. I don't know if we can send resources out to the people who participated in today's webinar, but I have links to, I have the names of these books handy that we can send around. With that, hopefully we have a little bit of time for questions. Sorry, I went a little bit over. This link will take you to joining the Connecticut Audubon Society. If you're not a member yet, or you can afford to support Connecticut Audubon at this very tough time, it's very critical and critically important. We need all the help we can get at this time. So I know we realize that it's a tough time for everybody, but we really need any help you're able to provide. And for those of you who donated to support this webinar, thank you so much. And hopefully we have a little bit of time for questions. Sorry, I did go a little bit over, but we covered a lot of ground today.
We do have one question to begin with. Is Vinca okay?
Vinca, it doesn't have much value, but you know, it's not really invasive. It's kind of, it spreads. It's a great ground cover. I guess it's probably better than lawn, but I haven't seen too many pollinators using Vinca.
How about, will swamp milkweed tolerate brackish water?
No, not brackish water. But you know, it grows in coastal areas, but as long as you have a little bit of elevation up, it actually spreads by seed. But yeah, not brackish water in a salt marsh.
How often and how frequently should you cut your any aster down before July?
I like to do it in stages, cut some of it down, leave some of it tall. The taller stuff will bloom earlier, but you can cut it right down to the ground up to July 1st. So you can do it at different times. You could do some, you know, the advantage of that, you know, when you have this really dense nectar garden with the black-eyed Susans and the echinacea, this is the pale purple coneflower here. This is the pale purple coneflower. This is the regular purple coneflower. Cutting back the asters allows them to steal the show early on, if you will. You know, I like to, wherever I have coneflowers, I want to make, and black-eyed Susans, I want to cut back the asters so that they're not overshadowing them.
Why is a rain garden better than a dry well?
Dry well could work, but rain gardens offer some added benefits. If you're using native plants, they're benefiting, you know, as host plants and also as nectar sources. So either way, you know, the idea is to infiltrate the water so it doesn't go on the impervious surface and pick up things like oil and the like. And also, if there's any pesticides or fertilizer, getting it infiltrated in the ground will help to ensure it doesn't reach Long Island Sound.
What species of clover is native, as stated?
The white clover.
Okay. And then what about phlox? They seem to attract pollinators.
Yeah, phlox is a a good garden plant. They do attract pollinators, and you know they're pretty. So you know, I don't discourage planting some you know, even cultivars. I like to plant different varieties of the coneflower. The one that's going to be most beneficial to both the pollinators and the birds is the purple coneflower, the wild variety, and that will actually spread more than the others. The white one is actually also quite popular, but I like to throw different colors in just because they're pretty.
What about Mexican sunflowers?
Mexican sunflowers are great. They're great for late nectar and also for seeds.
And how about rhododendrons?
Especially in the native rhododendron, the rhododendron maxima, rose bay rhododendron. But rhododendrons are a good shade plant, early nectar source. They're pretty, but the rose bay rhododendron is native, and it blooms quite a bit later. It gets larger, so you have to have, you know, a big area for it to grow in.
Okay, I think we have a follow-up. Genus species of white clover native. Oh, I think Native Plant Trust does not list any clover species as natives, only introduced. I'm not sure.
Huh. Perhaps I'm wrong.
And let me just say one other one. Goldenrod is native, but it's so aggressive. What do you suggest to control it?
Some species of goldenrod are aggressive, and again, you can cut it back. You know, you want to be an active gardener, and you can cut back the goldenrods, which will bloom later, or maybe not at all. But you can leave some goldenrods in the area. Tall goldenrod, which is Altissima is the species name. Solidago, although a lot of them are changed. It's not Solidago anymore, but Altissima is one of the ones that I like. It's one of the more productive ones. Canada goldenrod is very aggressive. Showy goldenrod is not. If you have a dry patch of your yard, a great one is something called grass leaf goldenrod, which will spread by runners, but it only gets to be about knee high. And it's just amazing when it's in bloom in terms of it's like a small airport with the comings and goings of the different pollinators. So yeah, goldenrods can be aggressive, but you know, you can cut them back.
We have somebody asked if you can do you have recommendations that we could probably do this offline of who could come out to people's homes and make suggestions?
I don't really have anybody that does that anymore. You know, but you can. There's some great native nurseries like Earth Tones in Roxbury or Woodbury, I forget which. There's Native Ink in Fairfield, and Oliver's also is pretty good with the native plants. So you can get advice and there's wherever you are in the state, there's a lot of nurseries that are specializing more and more in native plants. And if they don't have strictly native plants, they have a native plant section.
Okay, I think we can wrap it up for now. I want to, Patrick, if you just want to wrap it up, then that'd be great.
Sure. Well, I just want to thank everybody for joining us. And again, you know, if you're not a member of Connecticut Audubon Society, please consider joining. And if you can support us at this time, our work is ongoing. Our trails are open. A lot of the town trails have been closed, but we have such big areas that people can still social distance on our properties. We're actually, right now, we have some of the only nonprofit folks out on the beaches stewarding the piping plovers right now, because some of the other nonprofits are not allowed to do field work, some of the national nonprofits, but we actually have been able to hire field staff to be out there monitoring the piping plovers and American oyster catchers, you know, just a sort of a skeleton crew going by. But we do good work. We're very active in the policy arena. Where we have a lot of online content that we're providing, both videos and webinars. So please support us if you're able.